Everybody's heart's breaking now, and you feel the world is ending somehow, and you wonder how you find a way out. Oh, everybody's heart's breaking now. Everybody's heart's breaking now, when the oceans and the rivers run round, and what's living inside them's drowned. Oh, everybody's heart's breaking now, breaking now, breaking now. And you don't know what's right, you hold on to the heart. And you don't know what's right, and you hold on to the Everybody's heart's breaking now, when the children are coming down, and there's so much that's wasted downtown. Oh, everybody's heart's breaking now, breaking now, breaking now. Don't know what's right, and you hold on to time. And you don't know what's right, you hold on to time. Breaking love, breaking love. Breaking up. Oh, everybody's heart's breaking now, the children are coming down. Oh, everybody's heart's breaking now, the children are coming down.
I organized a conference to give voice to our side of this war called Freedom to Connect. Last year I invited Aaron to speak at Freedom to Connect. He asked me what he should talk about, and knowing Aaron, I said, anything you want, man. But I told him, really work on it. Give the speech of your life, because I knew he would rise to the challenge. And as you can see, or maybe as you've seen on Democracy Now! Or in various other places, YouTube, etc., he did rise to that challenge. So a few days before his speech, I touched base with him and I said, what are you going to say? And he told me, and I was surprised that he wasn't mentioning his own JSTOR fight. I said, aren't you going to cover that? He said simply, no. 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 Aaron wanted to talk about the big fights, the fights to make the world a better place. And I'm afraid that Aaron's legacy is going to be dumbed down to hacker, copy fighter, the way the media dumbed down the SOPA fight to Google versus the telephone companies. So let's not forget that Aaron fought the bigger fight, the fight for access, the fight for justice, the fight for democracy, the fight for us, for this community and for the greater community that it is all humankind. So, now we're going to watch some excerpts from his Freedom to Connect speech, and as you'll see, Aaron actually says it better than I could, so over to you, Aaron.
Once wrote, "There are men who struggle for a day, and they are good. There are others who struggle for a year, and they are better. There are some who struggle for many years, and they are better still. But then there are those who struggle all their lives, and these are the indispensable ones." Aaron Swartz was one of the indispensable ones. As you've heard, Aaron was a very complex and wondrous soul, and I feel so privileged to have been one of the people who got to see him in all these other forms. He loved Ada, he was so patient, he was just, we say the beautiful soul is hard unless you met him to know how sincere and authentic that really was. This was the person that he had become. And he was also, though, this consummate team member who could be part of the broader human race in most wondrous ways. His primary work when working at ThoughtWorks was to lead and build the next generation of tools for organizing and democratizing campaigning. He was deeply worried that this wonderful world of technology that had been created was going to be usurped and not end up being a tool of democracy with the small d. So when I first met him, he was like all these ideas. He'd say, "Roy, I've studied these campaigns and how we've done so well. I've got this idea for how to do A/B testing with campaigns. But one of the things we have to guarantee is that a woman in India, in rural India, with her simple cell phone, she could run the campaign that she wants without the need for the experts and for others." He was that much of a caring person. He was, in my humble opinion, one of the true extraordinary revolutionaries that this country has produced. He was a leader. He was a mentor. When we first gave him his team here in New York, we got people from all over the world to work for him. But he's a clever guy. He's all people he hasn't met. So what does he do? He puts on the theme song for the Muppets and starts singing the Muppet song, and then starts pairing away with all the developers. For those who don't know developers, it's not a normal sort of mode of operating. And within minutes, he had mesmerized and inspired and changed the dynamics of his interactions. We had a moment of silence across the world in all of our 20-something offices. And, it's hard to say how he'd been on a video conference with me in front of about 1,000 people. We had live streamed, and we were actively trying to figure out how to launch the campaign for his defense. And he couldn't say much about the campaign itself, but he desperately wanted to show people, that this was not about Aaron. This was about a broad issue. He was so uncomfortable in that moment because he knew that he had been railroaded into something that was a side issue on the scheme of his master agenda. He was truly, as The Economist, not my favorite magazine, but he said, truly in The Economist, he was a commons man. He deeply wanted to protect humanity's intellectual treasures as part of these commons. Economically, he believed that the creation of academic and intellectual property was a social process, often paid by the governments and by the public, And as had been the case with libraries in previous centuries, he demanded that they stay part of the public good. He also was not, I have to say, unfortunately in our industry, in this technology industry, we have a lot of egomaniacs and egotists. He was not that. He firmly believed that the accident of his considerable intellectual prowess gave him no right to appropriate the essential good that is the common tradition of the human race, which is intellectual knowledge. We were at the funeral with his father, and I know some of you are parents here. There's nothing more wretched, as you know, than having to give a eulogy for your own son. And Bob did it in the most humane in a way that all of us cried, of course, when he spoke. But then he made something that stuck a knife in my heart. He made a very lucid point about the duplicity of our society that protects those who accumulate wealth and treats those like Aaron in a completely different fashion. We heard just a few moments ago how many young students who are, precocious with technology do things. It is well known that Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs bent the rules for their own good. They did it for themselves. They engaged in shady practices of use of public property whilst at the university in their early days. None of them faced 35 years in prison. Instead, they have amassed great wealth. They are worshipped. Yet here's Aaron, somebody whose life is the exact opposite of these people. I've met these people, I've met Aaron. You cannot imagine a polar opposite of beauty of human beings. And here is the opposite of that, and yet he fought every moment. He lived his truth. He only worked on the important. He really, really did. There was not a day that he didn't do that. And yet, he used his incredible talents and privilege for the advocates of those without. So we have a choice. What Bob taught me at that funeral, we have a choice today. We have this very small and unique opportunity in history to shake up the control by these self-aggrandizing egomaniacs who use technology for the good of the 1%. This is not something that Aaron's legacy is to feel about. Aaron was a systems thinker, and he saw that this large accumulation of economic wealth in the form of private corporations was subverting everything in its path. He was, as his close friend David Siegel said, a communitarian. It is these ideals that we should uphold. His views on students, he gave a speech, some of you have seen it, I think, on Democracy Now! From the clips, but in his speeches, he was encouraging U.S. students to think about their own privilege, because when they have gone to an elite university and they have all these very stored documents, he made the salient point that opportunity doesn't exist for the young child in India. What right do we have for that knowledge which has come from the ages of the Enlightenment? And he's just so clever in how he constructs the right frame of things that he said, this is the way we can deal with open access and social justice. He was always challenging us. He's always amazed all of us who look at him and say, how do you come up with this idea? We do it this way, in this correct way. This is that kind of guy. But tonight I also want to tell you about a side of Aaron that is very important to me because I grew up all over the world. Aaron was a deeply internationalist soul. A few weeks ago, I had invited a small group of progressive Muslims into our offices to talk about how we deal with the growing violence against Muslims and people that think are Muslims in our country. This was just after the subway event where the woman had pushed the young man into his death. And so, as is by nature, I'd seen Aaron earlier in the day. I said, Aaron, you gotta come to this meeting, man. I was going to show up to the meeting. And of course, Aaron did that. And he came to the meeting, in the evening. I was actually on Skype at that point.
And as always, here's Aaron listening for an hour to all of these complicated things, both of us learning about, what is the status of politics of the Muslim community here in the United States, and etc. But absorbing all of this thing. And most of us are probably double his age. And he waits and all of a sudden he begins to talk and he says, I think you guys have framed this issue incorrectly. The right way to frame this issue is we have to conduct a campaign against the merchants of hate. There was silence. He had properly characterized what was the issue at hand in a way that everybody in America could understand and that we could understand. And I want to tell you that the people who are in that room with Aaron are sitting here today weeping at the loss of Aaron. And they've asked me, Boyd, how can we allow our country to take away this beautiful voice? Here is this young, beautiful Jewish kid. He's a kid to me. I know he's a man, but that voice had no right to be taken from us. It had no right. And I rotated between sadness and crying and anger when I know that when people like that are taken and we don't raise our voices, we are complicit. And I'm so proud of so many of you. Aaron would have wanted us to look into history to understand our next tasks. I mean, understand, Aaron touched so many of us in the progressive community that we were unable to sort of figure out what is the strategies and tactics of next. But he was a consummate, so he wanted to be a historian and a sociologist and many things. Revolutions are made by people. They're not made by heroes. But nevertheless, leaders matter greatly everywhere in the world. Our country has a tradition of creating a climate of fear whenever they risk change. This climate of fear started, obviously, under slavery, but even in the post-slavery period under Reconstruction, when you had the Jim Crow laws, we introduced fear in the post-Reconstruction South. We've witnessed the McCarthy period. We are now witnessing the war against terror and the rise of Islamophobia in our country. And when our government fails to intimidate, they silence their opponents. "52 years ago, Patrice Lumumba was murdered by the Belgian and United States government in the Congo. He was one of the most important leaders of his generation, and in fact, centuries in Africa. He was that significant. It took us almost 40 years for it to be impossible for the United States to deny that they had a role in his assassination. 45 years ago, in the jungles of Bolivia, Che Guevara was assassinated on the orders of the CIA. Aaron knew and decided consciously the system with which he was taking on. Aaron was a target of the FBI. After the Pacer incident, they followed him. He was strip searched. Let's not pretend that this was not a political issue of Aaron's voice on SOPA and the rest of the issues that we fought. Last December, I was able to introduce two of my, I have a number of heroes, but two of them very close to me. One is Aaron, and the other is P. Sainath, who is India's living greatest journalist, who's covered rural poverty in India for the last 20 years, which, as you know, is a very difficult subject. And the two of them, the three of us actually, began talking. So I wrote him, I think in the second day, and he heard. And this is what Sainath wrote back to me. "This was, and I say it without hesitation, not suicide. It was murder by intimidation, bullying, and torment. First, we must demand accountability for those who tormented Aaron. We do not do so to personalize the issue or to seek revenge. That is not our motivation. We understand that if we allow the climate of fear to exist, the damage that will be done is that the next Aaron will not come. That is a future that we will not accept in our world. That's a future unacceptable. During our annual retreat this summer, Aaron had joined 5 of his colleagues we had a number of speakers discussing one of the more egregious cancers of our country, which is the U.S. justice system. We have 5% of the world's population, and yet 25% of the prisoners in the world are incarcerated in our country. African Americans now account for 1 million of the 2.3 million prisoners. 80,000 people, as we sit here today, are in constrained confinement or solitary confinement. Solitary confinement has been condemned by the United Nations as a form of torture. And Aaron, he was deeply conscious of privilege. He really thought, and he would not have wanted it to be in history, that it would take somebody of his stature and his connections to bring attention to this plagued and abusive system of plea bargaining in America. Aaron is like many of tens of thousands of Americans who don't have his influence and doesn't have his friends and wonderful people we have here. This system that is in America today is an abuse of state power. A fitting legacy for Aaron will be the dismantling of business. And a second and more direct legacy must be to change the Computer Wire and Abuse Act. Yes. We must help Congresswoman Loughman craft the right language. It has to not only be about getting rid of the question of criminalizing terms of service, it has to get rid of this ambiguity that's in the law so that unscrupulous prosecutors from Boston to Maine to wherever they are in this country, they don't have the latitude that they had to go after Aaron. We have to make sure that we're I want to close with the words of Frederick Douglass, one of the greatest leaders of our country, who spoke in this very hall about over 100 years ago, a few years after the emancipation from slavery. The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both. But it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what people will submit to, and you will find out the exact amount of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And they will continue until they are resisted, either with words or blows, or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. Dearest Aaron, we loved you dearly. Aaron was like a son to me, and it's very hard to describe. It was the last week. Aaron, you were a gentle giant. You believed in the constant struggle to right the wrongs of the world that previous generations had failed to correct. And for that, I looked at Aaron and said, I know that I have not done my duty in my generation. I feel that deeply. You refused to accept injustice as inevitable. You have touched and inspired us all with your vision of the social injustice for every person, every living person on this planet. We promise today with our deepest hearts to carry on your legacy to the best of our abilities. Brother Aaron, one love.
I love storytelling. Aaron, if you want to walk in and take over for me at any point, please do so. I Ira Glass, David Foster Wallace, Louis C.K. These are some of the people he admired most in the world, consummate storytellers. I remember once last year we took a trip to DC together just because he'd been invited to speak at some techie conference, I don't even remember the name of it. We spent a whole day in transit, and with him working on his speech and his PowerPoint just to give a talk to a few dozen programmers about why they should apply their skills towards politics. You can do magic, he told them with a snap of his fingers and a picture of Harry Potter. For each anecdote he told about how programming could make the world a better place. You can do magic, he said. Aaron really could do magic. Aaron's magic was in asking questions, first and foremost. He often told me that he thought the reason he was a fast programmer was because that he was just really good at asking Google what the right code snippets were. Aaron's magic was in asking questions and in believing that the answers were not inevitable. Why should for-profit corporations control the world's academic research? It's not a question most of us have ever thought to ask, despite going through years of university where we might be reading academic research every day. But once you ask it, the answer is obvious. They shouldn't. Aaron's magic was that he believed that that and so much else could change. More than that, he believed that he could change it, that he could change the world. And he was right. By last Friday, he'd already changed the world in so many ways. I'm very sad about what happened at many levels, and one of them is that I'm so sad that we'll never see all the ways he would have changed the world from here on out. Aaron would have loved to have been here and have the opportunity to speak to all of you. I have to say, though, I'm not sure he would have liked the structure of the program. He hated ceremony. The memorial services are for the living. And Aaron forfeited his right to make that decision last Friday. He hated ceremony. He hated weddings. I had 3 weddings to attend last summer. He refused to come to any of them, despite liking and knowing all of the friends who were getting married. He hated ceremony. If he were here, he'd be wearing jeans, tennis shoes, and a snarky t-shirt. When he surprised me last month with the suggestion we might want to get married, he said he'd want a Liz Lemon wedding. Long on privacy and love and short on sentimentality and speeches. I said we'd at least have to throw a party afterwards. He wasn't convinced. I said we should talk about it again after the trial. The trial. The case defined our life together. We started dating in June 2 years ago, just months after his life had been turned upside down by the arrest, but while the ordeal was still completely private. He told me there was something going on in his life that he didn't want to talk about. Called it the bad thing. For weeks, I didn't know what it was. Just that spending time with me was a good distraction for him. I had theories, wild speculation. My top guess for a while was that he had had an affair with Elizabeth Warren and was going to ruin her career. That really was my top guess. He called me one night. He was in Cambridge. I was at frisbee practice in DC. He told me that the bad thing might be on the news the next day and asked whether I wanted to hear from him first. I said yes. So he told me he'd been arrested and was being charged with downloading too many academic journal articles. I was silent briefly and then blurted out, "That's all? That doesn't sound like a very big deal." He giggled nervously and said, "Well, I guess it's not like anybody has cancer or anything." I thought about it and called him back a few hours later. "Sorry," I said, "I think I might have underreacted a little bit. I'm sure being arrested and prosecuted is very stressful." And he said, "Actually, yours is the most helpful reaction anybody's had so far. Please don't change it." For a long time, we didn't talk about the case very much. He wanted to protect me, and he wanted to cordon it off from the rest of his life. He was worried that I would be subpoenaed, or that his other friends would be subpoenaed, and so he kept it all to himself. He kept all of the stress and the anger and the fear to himself. We started talking more and more about it over the last few months as it became clear that the government was not going to recognize that this was just one big mistake. That Steve Hyman, the prosecutor, who was hell-bent on destroying Aaron's life, was not going to come to terms with the notion that Aaron was not a threat, that Aaron should not spend years behind bars, that Aaron should not be labeled a felon for the rest of his life. In December, there was a hearing that I went to with him. The trial was delayed for another hearing. At this hearing, the decision was made to delay the trial until April. And afterwards, we came out of the courtroom and I tried to give him a hug and he pushed me away. And he said, "Not in front of Steve Hyman. I don't want to show Steve Hyman that." Aaron would have loved to have been here. I'm not sure he would have liked me speaking about him this way. Despite his public profile, he was an intensely private person in many ways. But memorial services are for the living, and last Friday he forfeited his right to decide that. And I think that you, his friends, his family, his admirers, and the wider world have a right to know what he faced. He faced an unfair prosecution by this man, Steve Hyman, who had no sense of proportion or justice and just wanted to wrap Aaron up as a notch on his belt. And he could go into the cafeteria with the other prosecutors and high-five them. He faced Carmen Ortiz, a U.S. attorney who did nothing to rein Hyman in. He faced indifference from MIT, an institution that could have protected him with a single public statement and refused to do so in defiance of all of its own most cherished principles. And he faced a deeply dysfunctional criminal justice system, one that he is far from the only victim of. There are millions of Americans who face the kinds of ordeals that he did, most of them with many fewer resources and much less support than he did. And last Friday, he faced the prospect of yet another 3 months of uncertainty and ups and downs and being forced by the government to spend every fiber of his being on this damnable, senseless trial, with no guarantee that he could exonerate himself at the end of it. He was so scared and so frustrated and so desperate, and more than anything else, just so weary. I think he just couldn't take it another day. Aaron once told me early on when we were trying to navigate a long-distance relationship, and I was sort of apologizing for, I can't come to Boston this weekend, but I'd love it if you came to DC, but it's okay if you don't want to. I understand if you don't want to. And I think he had enough of my sort of caveats and said, "Look, I'm not in the habit of doing things I don't want to do."
There's a battle going on right now, a battle to define everything that happens on the internet in terms of traditional things that the law understands. So I think what you always do when you're a little guy facing a terrible future with long odds and little hope of success, I started an online petition. Starting from literally nothing. We went to 10,000 signers, then 100,000 signers, and then 200,000 signers, and 300,000 signers, in just a couple of weeks. And I wasn't just signing anything. We asked these people to call Congress, to call urgently. There was a vote coming up this week in just a couple days, and we had to stop it. And at the same time, we told the press about it, and about this incredible online petition that was taking off. And we met with the staff and members of Congress and pleaded with them to withdraw their support for the bill. I mean, it was amazing. It was huge. The power of the internet rose up in force against this bill, and then it passed unanimously. At the time, it felt like we were going around telling people these bills were awful, and in return, they told us that they thought we were crazy. I mean, we were kids walking around waving our arms about how the government was going to censor the internet. It does sound a little crazy. But when the bill came back and started moving again, suddenly all the work we had done started coming together. All the folks who talked to about it suddenly began getting really involved and getting others involved. Everything started snowballing. Just a few weeks later, I remember I was chatting with this cute girl on the subway, and she wasn't in technology at all, but when she heard that I was, she turned to me very seriously and said, "You know, we have to stop so."
Will swallow you.